The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Marcus Thompson's small apartment in Cedar Park, Texas, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. The 29-year-old former Marine sat at the edge of his bed, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he reached for the bottle of prescribed medication on his nightstand. Another sleepless night had passed, filled with the same recurring nightmare that had haunted him for the past 18 months. Marcus stood slowly, his 6-foot frame showing the effects of countless hours in the gym, a desperate attempt to exhaust his body enough to find peace in sleep. His dark hair was cropped short, military style, and his brown eyes carried a weight that seemed far too heavy for someone who hadn't yet reached 30. The reflection in his bathroom mirror showed a man who looked older than his years, with worry lines etched around his eyes and a jawline perpetually clenched with tension. The apartment was spartanly furnished, much like his barracks room had been during his 3 tours in Afghanistan. A single photograph sat on the kitchen counter, Marcus and his best friend, Sergeant David Rodriguez, both grinning widely in their desert camouflage uniforms, the Afghan mountains visible in the background. It was taken just 2 weeks before the IED explosion that took David's life and left Marcus with physical scars that had healed and emotional wounds that refused to close. His phone buzzed on the counter, displaying his sister Sarah's name. Marcus stared at it for several rings before reluctantly answering. "Morning, Sarah," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Marcus, thank God you answered. I was starting to worry when you didn't respond to my texts yesterday." Sarah Thompson Williams had always been the worrier in the family, but her concern had intensified since Marcus returned home. At 32, she was a successful real estate agent in Austin, married to her college sweetheart Jim, with 2 young children who barely knew their uncle. "I'm fine," Marcus replied automatically, the same response he gave to everyone who asked. "No, you're not fine, and we both know it." Sarah's voice carried the familiar mixture of love and frustration that had become their norm. "Marcus, I know you don't want to hear this, but you need to get out of that apartment. When's the last time you did something just for fun?" Marcus walked to his kitchen window, looking out at the suburban neighborhood where families were beginning their Saturday routines. Children rode bicycles on the sidewalk, while their parents tended to gardens and washed cars. It was the American dream he'd fought to protect, yet he felt completely disconnected from it. "I went to the grocery store yesterday," he offered weakly. "That doesn't count, and you know it." Sarah paused, and Marcus could hear the sound of her children playing in the background. "Listen, Jim got tickets to see George Strait next weekend at the Frank Owen Center. One of his clients couldn't use them. Why don't you come with us?" The suggestion made Marcus's chest tighten. Large crowds, loud noises, unexpected sounds, all triggers that could send him spiraling into a panic attack. "I don't think that's a good idea, Sarah." "Marcus, please. You used to love country music. Remember when we were kids and you'd play Dad's old records and sing along? You knew every George Strait song by heart." The memory hit him unexpectedly. Their father, Robert Thompson, had been a contractor who worked long hours, but always made time on Sunday afternoons to play his vinyl collection. Marcus could almost hear his father's voice singing along to "Amarillo Morning," while their mother, Linda, cooked dinner in the kitchen. Those had been simpler times, before deployments and loss and the crushing weight of survival. "That was a long time ago," Marcus said quietly. "It doesn't have to be. One night, Marcus, 3 hours. If you get uncomfortable, we'll leave, no questions asked. But please, just try, for me, for Mom and Dad." Their parents had died in a car accident during Marcus's 2nd deployment, a tragedy he'd been unable to attend the funeral for due to security concerns in his sector. The guilt of not being there for his family when they needed him most was another burden he carried. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of expectation and disappointment. Sarah had been nothing but patient and loving since his return, and he knew his isolation was hurting her too. "I'll think about it. That's all I ask. The concert's next Friday night. Think about it, okay?" After ending the call, Marcus sat in his living room, surrounded by the silence that had become both his comfort and his prison. The walls seemed to close in around him as memories of Afghanistan flooded back, the sound of helicopters, the weight of his gear, the constant vigilance required to stay alive. But most of all, he remembered David's laugh, the way his friend could find humor in even the darkest situations. David Rodriguez had been more than a battle buddy. He'd been the brother Marcus had never had. They'd enlisted together, trained together, and served 3 tours side by side. David had a wife, Elena, and a daughter, Sophia, who would never really know her father. Marcus had promised David he'd look after them, but the guilt and pain had made it impossible to face Elena's grief alongside his own. The afternoon passed slowly, with Marcus alternating between restless pacing and sitting motionless on his couch. He tried watching television, but the noise seemed too loud, too chaotic. He attempted reading, but the words blurred together on the page. Nothing held his attention for long, and everything reminded him of something he'd rather forget. As evening approached, Marcus found himself standing in front of his bathroom mirror again, this time examining the scars that marked his left shoulder and arm, reminders of the shrapnel that had torn through his body on that terrible day. The physical pain had faded, but the emotional wounds remained as fresh as ever. He thought about Sarah's invitation, about the prospect of sitting in a crowded arena surrounded by thousands of strangers. The idea terrified him, but perhaps that was exactly why he needed to do it. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, his therapist at the VA hospital, had repeatedly emphasized the importance of gradual exposure to the situations that triggered his anxiety. Dr. Hendricks was a soft-spoken woman in her 50s who specialized in treating combat veterans. She'd been patient with Marcus's resistance to treatment, understanding that healing couldn't be rushed or forced. "Recovery isn't about forgetting what happened," she told him during their last session. "It's about learning to carry the memories without letting them control your life." Marcus picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Sarah's number. Before he could talk himself out of it, he pressed call. "Marcus, is everything okay?" Sarah's voice immediately carried concern. "About the concert," he said quickly, before his courage could fail him. "I'll go." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Sarah spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "Really? You mean it?" "Yeah, I mean it, but Sarah, if I need to leave, we leave. No questions asked, I promise." Her relief was palpable through the phone. "Oh, Marcus, this is wonderful. Jim will be so excited, and the kids—" "Let's not make a big deal out of it," Marcus interrupted gently. "It's just a concert." But even as he said the words, Marcus knew it was more than that. It was a step, however small, toward rejoining the world he'd been hiding from. As he hung up the phone, he felt a mixture of anticipation and terror that reminded him of the moments before a mission, uncertain of what lay ahead, but committed to seeing it through. The rest of the evening passed more peacefully than most. Marcus managed to eat a full meal for the first time in weeks, and when he finally lay down to sleep, the nightmares that usually plagued him seemed less vivid, less immediate. Perhaps it was the prospect of having something to look forward to, or maybe it was simply the relief of making a decision after months of paralysis. As he drifted off to sleep, Marcus found himself humming an old George Strait melody, one his father used to play on those long-ago Sunday afternoons. For the first time in months, the silence in his apartment felt less oppressive, filled instead with the faint echo of better times and the possibility that they might come again. The week leading up to the concert passed, with agonizing slowness for Marcus Thompson. Each day brought a mixture of anticipation and dread that left him alternately energized and exhausted. He found himself second-guessing his decision to attend, then forcing himself to stick with it, then questioning it again in an endless cycle of doubt and determination. On Tuesday morning, Marcus drove to his regular appointment at the Central Texas Veterans Healthcare System. The facility was a sprawling complex of modern buildings that served thousands of veterans from across the region. The parking lot was always full, a sobering reminder of how many men and women carried invisible wounds from their service. Dr. Patricia Hendricks' office was on the third floor, decorated with calming earth tones and soft lighting that made it feel more like a comfortable living room than a clinical space. She was a woman who understood the delicate balance required to help combat veterans heal. Pushing too hard could cause them to retreat entirely, while not pushing at all allowed them to remain trapped in their trauma. "You seem different today, Marcus," Dr. Hendricks observed as he settled into his usual chair. She was perceptive in the way that good therapists were, able to read the subtle changes in posture and expression that revealed her patient's internal states. "My sister talked me into going to a concert this weekend," Marcus said, surprising himself with how easily the words came out. "Doctor." Hendricks raised an eyebrow, but kept her expression neutral. "That's significant. How do you feel about it?" "Terrified," Marcus admitted with a bitter laugh. "But I guess that means I should probably do it, right?" "What makes you think that?" Marcus had learned that Dr. Hendricks rarely gave direct answers, preferring to help him find his own insights. "You've been telling me for months that I need to start engaging with life again. This seems like a pretty big step in that direction." "It is a big step. What made you decide to take it?" The question hung in the air for several seconds before Marcus answered. "David would have kicked my ass if he knew I was hiding in my apartment, afraid of my own shadow." It was the first time he'd spoken David's name aloud in months. Dr. Hendricks leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about David." And for the first time since beginning therapy, Marcus did. He talked about how they'd met during basic training at Paris Island, two scared kids from Texas who'd bonded over their shared love of country music and their determination to serve their country. He described David's infectious optimism, his ability to find something to laugh about even in the worst conditions, and his unwavering loyalty to his fellow Marines. "He saved my life more times than I can count," Marcus said, his voice growing thick with emotion. "Not just the dramatic, heroic stuff, though there was plenty of that, but the everyday things too. Making sure I ate when I was too stressed to remember, talking me through the panic attacks I used to get before missions. He had this way of making everything seem manageable, even when we were in the middle of hell. It sounds like he was more than a friend. He was my brother in every way that mattered. We promised each other we'd make it home, that we'd be best men at each other's weddings, that our kids would grow up together." Marcus's hands clenched into fists. He kept his end of the bargain. He got me out of that explosion alive. And what did I do? I haven't even had the courage to face his widow. "Doctor." Hendricks waited for Marcus to continue, understanding that sometimes silence was the most powerful tool in her arsenal. "Elena sent me letters at first," Marcus went on. "Pictures of Sophia, updates about how they were doing. I never responded. How could I? What was I supposed to say? Sorry your husband died saving my worthless life?" Eventually the letters stopped coming. "Survivor's guilt is one of the most common and devastating effects of combat trauma," Dr. Hendricks said gently. "The question isn't why you survived and David didn't. That's a question without an answer. The question is what you're going to do with the life he helped save." The session continued for another 30 minutes, but those words echoed in Marcus's mind for the rest of the week. What was he going to do with the life David had saved? So far, the answer seemed to be hide from it. On Thursday afternoon, Sarah called to confirm the details for the concert. She would pick him up at 6 o'clock on Friday evening, giving them time to grab dinner before the show started at 8. "I'm proud of you, you know," she said before hanging up. "Mom and Dad would be proud too." That evening, Marcus did something he hadn't done in months. He called his old friend from high school, Tommy Patterson. Tommy had stayed in Cedar Park after graduation, taking over his father's auto repair shop and raising a family. He was one of the few people from Marcus's pre-military life who still reached out occasionally, undeterred by Marcus's consistent lack of response. "Well, I'll be damned," Tommy said when he heard Marcus's voice. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten how to use a phone." "I know I've been—" Marcus struggled to find the right words. "I haven't been a very good friend lately." "Hey, don't worry about it. I figured you'd talk when you were ready. How are you doing, man?" "Really doing?" The genuine concern in Tommy's voice almost broke Marcus's resolve to have a normal conversation. "I'm trying to get better, taking it one day at a time. That's all any of us can do. Listen, why don't we grab a beer sometime soon, like old times?" "I'd like that," Marcus said and realized he meant it. Friday arrived with unseasonable warmth for early November in Texas. Marcus spent the morning cleaning his apartment, a nervous habit that helped him feel more in control when anxiety threatened to overwhelm him. He changed clothes 3 times, settling finally on jeans and a plain button-down shirt, casual enough to blend in, but nice enough to show respect for Sarah's invitation. At 5:30, he was ready and waiting, pacing his living room and checking his watch every few minutes. When Sarah's SUV pulled into his parking lot, Marcus felt his heart rate spike. This was it, no turning back now. Sarah emerged from the driver's seat with a smile that could have powered the entire city of Austin. She looked effortlessly put together in dark jeans and a stylish blouse, her blonde hair styled in soft waves. At 32, she still looked remarkably like the sister who had helped raise him after their parents died. "You look good," she said, giving him a hug that lasted just long enough to be reassuring without being overwhelming. "You too. Where's Jim?" "He's meeting us at the restaurant." "The kids are with his parents tonight." Sarah studied his face carefully. "How are you feeling?" "Like I might throw up," Marcus answered honestly. Sarah laughed, but not unkindly. "That's probably normal. Come on, let's go eat something. Food always helps with nerves." The drive to downtown Austin took 45 minutes through heavy traffic, giving Marcus time to adjust to being in a car with another person, something that had become surprisingly difficult since his return. Sarah kept up a steady stream of conversation about her work, her children, and local news, not requiring much response from Marcus, but filling the silence that might otherwise have become oppressive. They met Jim Williams at a barbecue restaurant just a few blocks from the Frank Irwin Center. Jim was a good man, patient, kind, and utterly devoted to Sarah and their children. He greeted Marcus with a firm handshake and a warm smile, treating him like family rather than an obligation. "Thanks for the ticket," Marcus said as they were seated. "Are you kidding? I'm excited to have someone to go with who actually knows George Strait's music. Sarah pretends to like country, but I caught her humming Taylor Swift in the car on the way over." "Hey, some of her early stuff was country," Sarah protested, and the easy banter between the married couple helped Marcus relax slightly. Dinner was surprisingly pleasant. The restaurant was busy, but not overwhelmingly crowded, and Marcus found himself actually enjoying the food and conversation. Jim told stories about his work as an insurance adjuster, and Sarah shared funny anecdotes about her recent real estate clients. For brief moments, Marcus almost forgot about the anxiety that had been his constant companion for the past 18 months. As they finished their meal and prepared to walk to the arena, Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest beginning to return. The streets were filled with concert-goers, all heading in the same direction, their voices creating a buzz of excitement that seemed to press in on him from all sides. "You okay?" Sarah asked quietly, falling into step beside him as Jim walked slightly ahead. Just nervous, Marcus admitted. It's been a while since I've been around this many people. We can leave anytime you want. No questions, no guilt, no explaining necessary. Marcus nodded, grateful for her understanding but determined to see this through. As they approached the Frank Irwin Center, he could see the crowds gathering outside. Families with children wearing cowboy hats, couples on date nights, groups of friends laughing and taking pictures. It was a snapshot of normal life, the kind of carefree happiness that felt foreign to him now. The arena was impressive, with its modern architecture and bright lights welcoming thousands of fans. Marcus could feel his palms sweating as they joined the line to enter, but he forced himself to focus on Sarah's presence beside him and Jim's steady conversation about the opening act. As they showed their tickets and passed through security, Marcus caught a glimpse of the merchandise stands selling t-shirts and programs. One shirt caught his eye. It featured an American flag with the words, "God bless our troops," printed below it. The sight hit him like a physical blow, bringing back memories of yellow ribbon magnets and care packages, and the countless ways civilians tried to show support for those serving overseas. "Marcus?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from far away. He realized he'd stopped walking and was staring at the shirt display. "Sorry, just remembering something." Sarah followed his gaze, and understanding flickered across her face. "Do you want to get some air?" "No, I'm okay. Let's find our seats." The interior of the arena was a sensory overload, thousands of voices mixing together, bright lights, the smell of popcorn and beer, the underlying excitement that preceded any major event. Their seats were in the lower bowl, with a clear view of the stage where roadies were making final preparations for the show. As Marcus settled into his seat between Sarah and Jim, he tried to focus on his breathing exercises, the techniques Dr. Hendricks had taught him for managing anxiety. In through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 4. The repetition was calming, giving him something concrete to focus on besides the crowd and the noise. The opening act took the stage at 8 o'clock sharp, a young country singer named Jake Morrison who performed with energy and enthusiasm, warming up the crowd for the main event. Marcus found himself actually listening to the music, remembering how much he'd once loved the storytelling aspect of country songs, the way they captured universal experiences in simple, honest language. As Jake Morrison finished his set and the roadies began preparing for George Strait, Marcus felt a strange mixture of anticipation and apprehension. He was here, he'd made it this far, but the real test was yet to come. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he could almost hear David's voice encouraging him forward, reminding him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The lights dimmed, and 20,000 people rose to their feet as the unmistakable opening notes of Heartland filled the arena. Marcus Thompson, former Marine, wounded warrior, and broken man trying to heal, stood with them ready to face whatever came next. The roar of 20,000 voices singing along to Heartland was unlike anything Marcus Thompson had experienced since returning from Afghanistan. The sound was overwhelming and comforting simultaneously, a wall of pure joy and shared experience that seemed to fill every corner of the Frank Irwin Center. As George Strait walked onto the stage with his characteristic humble confidence, wearing his signature cowboy hat and a simple button-down shirt, Marcus felt something stir inside him that had been dormant for too long. George Strait at 69 was still the undisputed king of country music, his presence commanding the stage with an ease that came from decades of performing. He moved with the unhurried grace of a man who had nothing left to prove, his voice as rich and smooth as it had been when Marcus was a child listening to his father's records. There was something timeless about him, as if he existed outside the changing trends and temporary fads that defined modern entertainment. "Good evening, Austin," George called out, his Texas drawl carrying easily through the arena's sound system. The crowd erupted again, and Marcus found himself applauding along with everyone else, surprised by his own enthusiasm. Sarah leaned over, her eyes bright with excitement. "You're smiling," she said, having to raise her voice to be heard over the crowd. Marcus touched his face, realizing she was right. It was the first genuine smile he'd worn in months, and it felt strange, like using muscles that had forgotten their purpose. "I guess I am." The concert was masterfully paced, with George Strait moving seamlessly between his biggest hits and deeper album cuts that showcased his incredible range as a performer. He performed "All My Exes Live in Texas" with a wink and a grin that had the entire arena singing along, then shifted to the more contemplative "I Cross My Heart" that brought couples throughout the venue into each other's arms. Marcus found himself remembering why he'd fallen in love with country music in the first place. These weren't just songs, they were stories about real people living real lives, facing the same struggles and celebrating the same victories as everyone in the audience. George Strait had built his career on that authenticity, never trying to be anything other than exactly who he was, a cowboy from Texas who happened to sing better than almost anyone else alive. Halfway through the show, George paused between songs to address the crowd directly. "You know, folks, I've been doing this for a long time, and I've had the privilege of performing for audiences all over the world. But there's something special about coming home to Texas, playing for people who understand that country music isn't just entertainment, it's a way of life." The crowd responded with enthusiastic applause, but George wasn't finished. "I also want to take a moment to recognize some special people who might be with us tonight. We've got military families here, veterans who've served our country with honor, and active duty personnel who are still making sacrifices for our freedom. If you've served or you're currently serving, would you please stand up so we can show you our appreciation?" The request sent a jolt of panic through Marcus's body. Around the arena, men and women began standing, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes, all receiving thunderous applause from their fellow concertgoers. Sarah looked at him expectantly, but Marcus remained frozen in his seat, his hands gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "Marcus," Sarah said gently, "you should stand." "I can't," he whispered, the words barely audible over the continuing applause. He wasn't ready for this kind of recognition, wasn't prepared to be singled out as a hero when he felt like anything but. The guilt that had been his constant companion since David's death came rushing back with full force. How could he stand and accept gratitude when David, who deserved it so much more, would never stand again? Jim reached across Sarah and placed a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder. "It's okay, man. You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with." But the moment had passed anyway, and George Strait was moving on to his next song, Troubadour, a reflective piece about the life of a traveling musician. Marcus tried to focus on the music, but his anxiety had spiked, and he found his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Sarah noticed immediately. "Do you need to step outside?" Marcus shook his head, not trusting his voice. He was determined to see this through, to not let his trauma rob him of this experience that meant so much to Sarah. But as the concert continued, he found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on the performance. His mind kept wandering to that terrible day in Afghanistan, to the sound of the explosion, to David's final moments. It was during Carrying Your Love With Me that Marcus noticed the older man sitting 2 rows in front of them. He was probably in his 70s, wearing a Vietnam veteran's baseball cap and a jacket covered with military patches. His wife sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm as they swayed to the music. There was something in the man's weathered face that Marcus recognized, the distant look of someone who had seen things that couldn't be unseen, the careful composure of a person who had learned to carry heavy burdens with dignity. The veteran's presence was somehow comforting to Marcus. Here was a man who had probably struggled with his own demons, his own survivor's guilt, his own difficulty readjusting to civilian life. Yet he was here, decades later, enjoying music with his wife, having found a way to live with his memories rather than being destroyed by them. As George Strait moved into the final third of his performance, he began playing some of his most emotionally resonant songs. The Chair brought back memories of innocent romance, while Blue Clear Sky painted pictures of hope and redemption. But it was when he started the opening notes of Heartbreak on the Map that Marcus felt his carefully maintained emotional control beginning to slip. The song told the story of a small Texas town dealing with loss and the way communities come together in times of crisis. As George sang about neighbors helping neighbors and the strength found in shared sorrow, Marcus thought about his own community, the brothers he'd served with, the bond that had held them together through the worst of times, and how that bond had been shattered by David's death. The tears started slowly, just a moisture at the corners of his eyes that he wiped away quickly, hoping Sarah wouldn't notice. But as the song continued, describing the way love persists even in the face of unimaginable loss, the emotional dam that Marcus had built around his grief began to crack. He thought about David's laugh, the way his friend could find humor in any situation. He remembered the letters David used to write to Elena, reading them aloud in their shared tent, while Marcus pretended to be annoyed but secretly envied the depth of love his friend had found. He recalled David's excitement about becoming a father, the way he'd carried Sophia's ultrasound picture in his helmet, showing it to anyone who would look. By the time George Strait reached the song's final chorus, Marcus was crying openly, the tears streaming down his face as 18 months of suppressed grief finally found release. He was dimly aware of Sarah reaching for his hand, of Jim's concerned expression, but his focus was entirely on the music and the memories it was unleashing. The catharsis was both devastating and necessary. For so long, Marcus had been afraid to fully feel the weight of his loss, terrified that acknowledging the depth of his grief would somehow diminish David's sacrifice or prove that he wasn't strong enough to honor his friend's memory. But sitting in that arena, surrounded by thousands of strangers who were also moved by the universal themes of love and loss, he realized that grief wasn't a weakness to be overcome. It was love with nowhere to go. As Heartbreak on the Map ended and George Strait prepared for his next song, something extraordinary happened. The country music legend, known for his professionalism and rarely departing from his carefully planned performances, seemed to notice something in the audience. His experienced eyes, accustomed to reading crowds and connecting with individual faces among thousands, had somehow found Marcus Thompson sitting in section 117, row 15, seat 8. What George Strait saw was a young man in obvious emotional distress, tears streaming down his face, his shoulders shaking with the force of suppressed sobs. But more than that, he saw something in Marcus's bearing, in the way he held himself even in his grief that spoke of military service. There was a straightness to his posture even as he wept, a discipline that remained intact despite his emotional breakdown. George Strait had performed for countless military audiences throughout his career. He had sung for troops overseas, participated in benefit concerts for veteran causes, and had always felt a deep respect for those who served. His own son, George Bubba Strait Jr., had served in the army, giving the country's star a personal understanding of the sacrifices made by military families. Without a word to his band, George Strait set down his guitar and walked to the edge of the stage, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. The arena, sensing that something unplanned was happening, gradually grew quieter, 20,000 voices falling to a murmur as their attention focused on their beloved performer's unexpected behavior. "Hold on just a minute, folks," George said into his microphone, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had made him a legend. "I want to talk to someone out there." The spotlight operator, following George's gaze, found Marcus in the crowd, bathing him in brilliant white light that made his tears glisten like diamonds. Sarah squeezed his hand tighter, and Marcus felt a moment of panic at being singled out, but George Strait's next words stopped any thought of fleeing. "Son," George said, his voice carrying clearly through the arena's sound system, "I can see you're hurting, and I want you to know that everyone in this building tonight stands with you. Whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone." The arena was now completely silent, except for George's voice. 20,000 people holding their collective breath as they witnessed something unprecedented in the career of the king of country music. Marcus looked up at the stage, his vision blurred by tears, and for a moment it felt like George Strait was singing directly to him, as if the entire concert hall had faded away, leaving just two men sharing a moment of understanding across the divide between performer and audience. "I don't know your story," George continued, "but I can see in your face that you've served our country, and I want to thank you for that service. More than that, I want you to know that coming home is sometimes the hardest part of the journey, and there's no shame in struggling with that adjustment." Marcus tried to speak, to respond in some way, but his voice was trapped behind the emotion that had overtaken him. All he could do was nod, a simple gesture that somehow conveyed everything he couldn't put into words. What happened next would be talked about for years to come among country music fans and concert-goers who were lucky enough to witness it. Without any prompting, the entire arena began to applaud, not the thunderous, excitement-driven applause that had greeted George's hits, but something deeper and more meaningful. It was applause of recognition, of support, of community embracing one of its wounded members. As the applause continued, people began to stand, not just the veterans who had been asked to stand earlier, but everyone, families with children, elderly couples, teenagers, people from every walk of life rising to their feet to show support for a stranger who was courageously facing his demons in front of 20,000 witnesses. Sarah was crying now too, her hand still gripping Marcus's as she stood and applauded along with everyone else. Jim rose beside her, his own eyes moist with emotion at witnessing this extraordinary display of human compassion. Around them, complete strangers were wiping away tears, moved by the raw honesty of the moment and George Strait's decision to address it directly. Marcus finally managed to stand, his legs unsteady, but his resolve strengthened by the overwhelming support surrounding him. As he rose, the applause grew even louder, and he could see George Strait nodding approvingly from the stage, a slight smile creasing the performer's weathered face. "That's what I'm talking about," George said into his microphone as the applause finally began to fade. "That's the heart of Texas right there, folks. That's the heart of America. We take care of our own." The moment could have ended there, but George Strait wasn't finished. He gestured to his band, and they began playing the gentle opening notes of one of his most beloved songs, "I Cross My Heart." Days, but instead of singing it as the romantic ballad it was written to be, George's interpretation took on new meaning in the context of what had just occurred. "This one's for everyone who's ever made a promise to serve something bigger than themselves," George announced, "and for everyone who's ever struggled to find their way back home." As George Strait sang about promises kept and love that endures through hardship, Marcus felt something shift inside him. The grief was still there. It would always be there, but it no longer felt like a burden he had to carry alone. In this arena full of strangers who had become, for one evening, his community, he had found the beginning of what Dr. Hendricks had been trying to help him discover, the possibility of healing. The song ended to another round of sustained applause, and George Strait raised his hat in a gesture that encompassed the entire arena, but seemed directed specifically at Marcus. Then, with the professionalism that had defined his career, He picked up his guitar and seamlessly transitioned into "All My Exes Live in Texas," bringing the energy back up and allowing the concert to continue. But something fundamental had changed, not just for Marcus, but for everyone who had witnessed that moment. What they had seen was more than just a country music concert. It was a demonstration of the power of human connection, of the way music could bridge the gap between performer and audience, between stranger and friend, between isolation and community. As the concert moved toward its conclusion, Marcus found himself singing along to songs he hadn't heard in years, his voice joining with thousands of others in a celebration of life, love, and the complex beauty of the human experience. The weight he had carried for so long hadn't disappeared, but for the first time in 18 months, it felt manageable. The drive home from Austin was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than Marcus Thompson had grown accustomed to over the past 18 months. Instead of the oppressive weight of isolation and grief, this silence felt contemplative, almost peaceful. Sarah occasionally glanced at him in the rearview mirror, but she seemed to understand that he needed time to process what had happened at the concert. Jim had offered to drive Marcus's truck back to Cedar Park so the three of them could ride together, sensing that Marcus shouldn't be alone immediately after such an emotionally intense experience. It was a small gesture that spoke volumes about the kind of man Sarah had married, someone who understood that healing happened in community, not in isolation. "That was something else," Jim finally said as they passed the exit for Round Rock. "I mean, I've been to a lot of concerts, but I've never seen anything like that." Marcus nodded, still not quite ready to talk about what had occurred. The memory of standing in that spotlight, feeling the support of 20,000 strangers, seemed almost surreal now. Had it really happened, or was it some kind of stress-induced hallucination brought on by his first venture into a large crowd since returning from Afghanistan? "George Strait's always been special," Sarah said softly, "but what he did tonight, that took real courage. He could have just kept performing, but he chose to stop and acknowledge you. That means something, Marcus." "It means everything," Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. When they reached his apartment complex, Sarah walked him to his door while Jim waited in the car. Under the harsh fluorescent lighting of the exterior hallway, Marcus looked exhausted, but somehow lighter than he had in months. "Are you going to be okay tonight?" Sarah asked, her concern evident. "I could stay, or you could come home with us." Marcus shook his head. "I need to be alone for a while, to think about everything that happened, but Sarah." He turned to face his sister fully. "Thank you for not giving up on me, for making me go tonight." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled as she hugged him. "That's what family does. We show up even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." After Sarah and Jim left, Marcus stood in his living room, still wearing the clothes he'd worn to the concert, still carrying the emotional residue of the evening's events. He walked to his kitchen counter and picked up the photograph of himself and David Rodriguez, studying his friend's face with new eyes. For the first time since David's death, Marcus found himself able to remember his friend without the crushing weight of guilt overwhelming everything else. He could see David's smile, remember his laugh, recall the countless conversations they'd shared about their plans for after the war. David had wanted to become a teacher, to work with kids who needed positive male role models in their lives. He'd planned to coach Little League Baseball and take Sophia camping in the mountains of Colorado. "I'm sorry I haven't been to see Elena and Sophia," Marcus said aloud to the photograph. "I know that's not what you would have wanted. I've been so scared of facing their grief that I forgot they might need to see that you mattered to someone else too." The realization hit him like a physical blow. In his self-absorbed focus on his own pain, he had abandoned the family of his best friend, leaving them to grieve alone when he could have been sharing memories of David that only he possessed. Elena didn't know about the time David had saved a stray dog on base and nursed it back to health, or about how he used to practice reading children's books aloud so he'd be ready when Sophia was old enough for bedtime stories. Marcus walked to his bedroom and opened the drawer of his nightstand, pulling out a small box he hadn't touched since returning home. Inside were David's dog tags, given to him by David's commanding officer, along with a letter expressing the Marine Corps' condolences. Beneath the dog tags was David's wallet, which had somehow survived the explosion intact. With trembling hands, Marcus opened the wallet and found what he was looking for, a small piece of paper with Elena Rodriguez's phone number and address in San Antonio. He'd memorized the information months ago, but had been too paralyzed by guilt and grief to use it. The next morning arrived with the kind of brilliant Texas sunshine that made everything seem possible. Marcus woke feeling more rested than he had in months, despite having stayed up late into the night thinking about the concert and what it meant for his path forward. He made coffee and sat at his kitchen table, David's photograph propped up in front of him as he wrote a letter, something he should have done 18 months earlier. "Dear Elena," he began, his handwriting shaky but determined. "I know it's been too long since David's death, and I know that my silence has probably hurt you even more during an already impossible time. I don't have a good excuse for that, only the explanation that I've been drowning in my own grief and guilt, and I thought staying away was somehow protecting you from having to deal with my pain on top of your own. I was wrong about that, and I'm sorry. David saved my life, not just on the day he died, but every day we served together. He was the best man I've ever known, and I want you and Sophia to know that his sacrifice meant something, that he died protecting someone who loved him like a brother. I have so many stories about David that I should have shared with you by now. I want Sophia to know that her father was a hero, not just because of how he died, but because of how he lived. He talked about you and Sophia constantly, and he was so proud to be your husband and her father. If you're willing, I would like to visit you and Sophia soon. I understand if you're not ready for that, or if you'd prefer that I continue to stay away. But I hope we can find a way to honor David's memory together, because he deserves to be remembered by all the people whose lives he touched. With love and deepest respect, Marcus Thompson." Marcus read the letter 3 times before sealing it in an envelope and addressing it carefully. Then he drove to the post office and mailed it before he could change his mind, knowing that this was another step in the healing process that Dr. Hendricks had been encouraging him to take. On Monday morning, Marcus called the VA hospital and scheduled an emergency appointment with Dr. Hendricks. She was able to see him that afternoon, and when he walked into her office, she immediately noticed the change in his demeanor. "You look different," she observed as he settled into his usual chair. "Something significant has happened." Marcus told her about the concert, about George Strait stopping the show to acknowledge him, about the support he'd felt from 20,000 strangers, and about his decision to reach out to Elena Rodriguez. Dr. Hendricks listened without interruption, occasionally nodding but allowing him to tell the story at his own pace. "It sounds like you experienced what we call a breakthrough moment," she said when he finished. "These don't happen often, and they can't be forced or planned. But when they do occur, they can be incredibly powerful catalysts for healing." "I feel different," Marcus admitted. "I'm still sad about David, and I don't think that will ever completely go away. But for the first time since he died, I can remember him without feeling like I'm drowning." "That's exactly what healthy grief looks like," Dr. Hendricks explained. "It's not about forgetting or getting over loss. It's about learning to carry the memory of someone you loved without being crushed by the weight of that love." They spent the rest of the session talking about practical steps Marcus could take to build on the progress he'd made. Dr. Hendricks suggested that he consider joining a veterans support group, not because he was failing to heal on his own, but because community and shared experience were powerful tools for recovery. The moment you described at the concert, feeling supported by strangers who understood your pain, that's what happens in group therapy all the time, she explained. You might find it helpful to connect with other veterans who are working through similar challenges. Marcus left the appointment with a list of local support groups and a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in months, he felt like he had a direction forward rather than simply existing from day to day. On Wednesday evening, Elena Rodriguez called him. Marcus was washing dishes when his phone rang, and he almost didn't answer because he didn't recognize the number. But something made him pick up on the fourth ring. "Marcus, this is Elena Rodriguez." Her voice was soft but strong, carrying just a hint of the Texas accent that David had always found so charming. Marcus's heart began racing, and he had to sit down to steady himself. "Elena, thank you for calling. I wasn't sure if you'd want to hear from me." "I needed time to think about your letter," she said. "I was angry with you for a long time, Marcus. Not because David died saving you, I could never be angry about that, but because you disappeared afterward, and I felt like I'd lost both of you." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, but he forced himself to listen without interrupting. "But then I realized that I didn't understand what you were going through," Elena continued. "David used to tell me about the bond you two had, about how you looked out for each other. He said you were the brother he'd never had, and that losing you would destroy him. I think I forgot that losing him might destroy you too." "It almost did," Marcus admitted. "I'm still not sure I'm going to make it through this, but I'm trying. And I want to honor David's memory the right way. I want Sophia to know what an incredible father she had, even if she's too young to remember him." "She's 3 now," Elena said, and Marcus could hear the smile in her voice. "She looks just like David, but she has my stubborn streak. She asks about her daddy all the time, and I've been telling her stories, but I know there are so many things about him that only you know." They talked for over an hour, sharing memories of David and beginning to plan a visit. Elena lived in San Antonio with her parents, who had been helping her raise Sophia since David's death. She was working as a nurse at a local hospital, the same job she'd had when she and David first met. "There's something else," Elena said as their conversation was winding down. "David left you something. A letter. He wrote it before his last deployment and gave it to me with instructions to give it to you if anything happened to him. I've been carrying it around for months, not knowing how to get it to you." Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. "A letter? He said it was important and that you'd understand when the time was right. Maybe that time is now." They arranged for Marcus to visit the following weekend, and when he hung up the phone, he felt a mixture of anticipation and terror at the prospect of reading David's final words to him. But more than that, he felt gratitude for Elena's forgiveness, for the chance to be part of Sophia's life, and for the possibility of healing that had begun with a country music concert and a moment of unexpected human connection. That night, Marcus slept peacefully for the first time in 18 months, untroubled by nightmares or the crushing weight of survivor's guilt. In his dreams, he heard David's laugh and George Strait's voice singing about promises kept and love that endures through hardship. When he woke the next morning, he was humming "I Cross My Heart" and thinking about the drive to San Antonio that would take him one step closer to the man he used to be and the man he was still becoming. The drive from Cedar Park to San Antonio took Marcus Thompson through the heart of Texas Hill Country, a landscape of rolling hills, ancient oak trees, and small towns that seemed frozen in time. It was early November, and the leaves were just beginning to change, painting the countryside in shades of gold and rust that reminded Marcus of autumn afternoons from his childhood. He had left early Saturday morning, wanting to give himself plenty of time to mentally prepare for what would be the most emotionally challenging day since David Rodriguez's funeral, which he hadn't been able to attend. The letter Elena had mentioned was never far from his thoughts during the 2-hour drive, and he found himself alternately eager and terrified to read his best friend's final words to him. Elena's childhood home was in a quiet neighborhood on San Antonio's west side, a modest ranch-style house with a well-maintained yard and a swing set visible in the backyard. Marcus sat in his truck for several minutes after parking, gathering his courage and trying to calm his racing heart. Through the front window, he could see movement inside the house, and he knew that Elena was probably watching for his arrival. Before he could lose his nerve, Marcus walked to the front door and knocked gently. The door opened almost immediately, and Elena Rodriguez stood before him for the first time since David's death. She was smaller than he remembered, probably no more than 5 feet 4 inches tall, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and brown eyes that held both sadness and strength. At 28, she still looked remarkably young, but there was a maturity in her bearing that spoke of someone who had been forced to grow up too quickly. "Marcus," she said simply, and then stepped forward to embrace him. The hug lasted longer than either of them had expected. Two people who had loved David Rodriguez in different but equally profound ways, finally coming together to share their grief. When they separated, both had tears in their eyes, but they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. "Come in," Elena said, leading him into a living room that was warm and inviting, decorated with family photographs and children's toys scattered across the carpet. "Sophia is napping, but she should be up soon. She's been talking about meeting Daddy's friend Marcus all week." They sat together on the couch, and for a few moments neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood that some experiences were too profound for immediate words. "I brought something for you," Marcus said finally, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out David's dog tags, which he had been carrying since the concert. "These were given to me after it happened. I thought you should have them." Elena took the dog tags with trembling hands, running her fingers over David's name and service number. "Thank you," she whispered. "I've been wondering about these." "There's something else," Marcus continued. "I know this might sound strange, but I want to help with Sophia's education, college fund, whatever she needs. David would have wanted to provide for her, and since I'm alive because of him, I feel like it's my responsibility." Elena looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Marcus, you don't owe us anything. David didn't save you so that you'd feel obligated to—" "This isn't about obligation," Marcus interrupted gently. "It's about family. David was my brother, which makes Sophia my niece and you my sister-in-law. I want to be part of her life if you'll let me." Before Elena could respond, they heard the sound of small feet running down the hallway, and a little girl appeared in the doorway. Sophia Rodriguez was indeed her father's daughter, with the same dark hair and bright smile that had made David's face light up whenever he talked about her. She was clutching a stuffed animal, a small bear wearing what looked like military fatigues. "Mama, is this Daddy's friend?" Sophia asked, her voice carrying the slight lisp that was common in 3-year-olds. "Yes, baby, this is Marcus. He was Daddy's best friend in the Marines." Sophia approached Marcus without any of the shyness that many children showed around strangers. She climbed onto the couch beside him and held up her stuffed bear for his inspection. "This is Sergeant Bear," she announced proudly. "Mama says Daddy would have gotten him for me if he was still here." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "Sergeant Bear looks very brave, just like your daddy was." "Did you know my daddy?" Sophia asked, settling against Marcus's side with the unconscious trust that children showed to people they instinctively liked. "I knew your daddy very well," Marcus replied. "We were best friends, and he talked about you all the time. He was so excited to meet you, and he loved you so much even before you were born." For the next hour, Marcus told Sophia stories about her father, carefully edited versions that focused on David's humor, his kindness, and his dedication to his fellow Marines. He described how David had carried Sophia's ultrasound picture everywhere, showing it to anyone who would look. He told her about David's plan to teach her to play baseball and take her camping in the mountains. Sophia listened with the rapt attention that children reserved for stories about people they loved, asking questions and making connections that showed she was absorbing every detail. Elena watched the interaction with tears streaming down her face, finally seeing her daughter connect with her father's memory in a meaningful way. As the afternoon wore on, Elena's parents returned from their grocery shopping trip. Maria and Carlos Hernandez were in their 60s, warm and welcoming people who had embraced Marcus's family from the moment Elena explained who he was. Maria immediately insisted on cooking dinner for everyone, while Carlos, a Vietnam veteran himself, sat with Marcus on the back porch and shared stories about the challenges of readjusting to civilian life. "The first few years are the hardest," Carlos said, offering Marcus a beer as they watched Sophia play on her swing set. "Not because it gets easier to carry the memories, but because you learn that you're stronger than you think you are." "Some days, I'm not so sure about that," Marcus admitted. "That's normal. But you're here, aren't you? You could have stayed home, stayed isolated, but you chose to come here and face Elena and Sophia. That takes real courage." As evening approached and Marcus prepared to drive back to Cedar Park, Elena handed him a manila envelope. "This is from David," she said simply. "He wrote it during his leave before the last deployment. He said to give it to you when I thought you were ready to hear what he had to say." Marcus took the envelope with hands that shook slightly. David's handwriting was unmistakable on the front, for Marcus Thompson, "To be opened only if I don't make it home." "I don't know if I'm ready," Marcus said honestly. "David thought you would be when the time came," Elena replied, "and I think he was right." The drive back to Cedar Park passed in a blur of emotion and anticipation. Marcus had placed the envelope on his passenger seat, and he was acutely aware of its presence throughout the entire journey. By the time he reached his apartment, it was nearly 10 o'clock, and he was emotionally exhausted from the day's events. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, the envelope in front of him, trying to summon the courage to open it. Finally, he carefully tore open the seal and pulled out several pages of David's distinctive handwriting. "Marcus," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home, and I'm sorry for that. Not just because I wanted to see Elena and Sophia again, but because I know how hard my death is going to be on you, and I wish I could spare you that pain. By now, you're probably blaming yourself for what happened to me. You're probably thinking that you should have died instead, or that you could have done something differently to save me. I need you to stop thinking that way, because it's not true, and it's not what I would want for you. The truth is, if our situations were reversed, if you had died and I had survived, I would be going through exactly the same thing you're going through now. That's what love does to us. It makes us feel responsible for the people we care about, even when we have no control over what happens to them. But here's what I need you to understand. I didn't save your life so that you could spend the rest of it feeling guilty about being alive. I saved your life because you're my brother, and because the world needs Marcus Thompson in it. You have so much to offer, so much good you can do, and I refuse to let my death be the thing that stops you from becoming the man I know you can be. I want you to live, Marcus, really live. I want you to find someone to love the way I love Elena. I want you to have children and teach them to play baseball and take them camping in the mountains, all the things I won't be able to do with Sophia. I want you to remember me, but not in a way that keeps you trapped in the past. Take care of Elena and Sophia for me, but not because you owe them something. Take care of them because they're your family now, and because love is the only thing that makes any of this worthwhile. You're going to be okay, Marcus. It might take a while, and it might be harder than anything you've ever done, but you're going to be okay. I believe that with everything I have. Your brother always, David. Marcus read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning and comfort. David had known him well enough to anticipate the guilt and self-blame that would follow his death, and had taken the time to address those feelings directly. More than that, David had given him permission to heal, to move forward, to live a life worthy of the sacrifice that had been made. As Marcus finally went to bed that night, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for 18 months. The grief was still there, it would always be there, but it no longer felt like a burden too heavy to carry. Instead, it felt like love in a different form, a way of honoring David's memory while still embracing the future. The next morning, Marcus called Sarah and told her about his visit with Elena and Sophia, about David's letter, and about his plans to be more actively involved in their lives. Sarah cried openly as he spoke, relieved beyond words to hear hope and purpose in her brother's voice again. "I'm so proud of you," she said. "Mom and Dad would be proud too." Marcus also called Dr. Hendricks and scheduled an appointment to discuss the breakthroughs he'd experienced over the weekend. He was ready now to do the hard work of healing, to engage fully in therapy, and perhaps join the veterans support group she had recommended. But first, he had a phone call to make. Marcus dialed the number for Tommy Patterson's auto shop, knowing his old friend would be there even on a Sunday, probably working on some project that couldn't wait until Monday. "Tommy, it's Marcus. You know that beer you mentioned? How about this afternoon?" "Hell yes," Tommy replied immediately. "It's about time." As Marcus prepared to leave his apartment to meet his friend, he looked once more at the photograph of himself and David Rodriguez. But this time, instead of seeing guilt and loss, he saw brotherhood and love, and the promise of a future that would honor the past without being imprisoned by it. He thought about George Strait's words from that night at the Frank Irwin Center. "Whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone." The country music legend had been right. Healing happened in community, in the connections between people who understood each other's struggles and chose to support each other through them. Marcus Thompson, former Marine, surviving warrior and brother to the living and the dead, stepped out of his apartment and into the Texas sunshine, ready to rejoin the world that David Rodriguez had died protecting. The music hadn't stopped that night in Austin. It had simply changed key, from a song of sorrow to a song of hope, from a melody of isolation to a harmony of community. As he drove to meet Tommy, Marcus found himself humming "I Cross My Heart" and thinking about the promises we make to each other and to ourselves. Some promises are kept in ways we never expect, and some songs continue long after the last note has been played. The most important promise of all, the promise to keep living, to keep loving, to keep honoring those who came before us, was one Marcus Thompson was finally ready to keep. In the rearview mirror of his truck, he could see his apartment complex growing smaller, but he wasn't looking back with regret anymore. He was looking forward, toward the future David Rodriguez had saved for him, toward the life he was finally ready to live. The story of that night when the music stopped, when George Strait interrupted his concert to acknowledge a grieving veteran, would be told and retold for years to come. It would become part of country music lore, a testament to the power of human connection and the courage it takes to reach across the divide between performer and audience, between stranger and friend. But for Marcus Thompson, it wasn't just a story. It was the moment when he learned that healing wasn't something you did alone, that love was stronger than loss, and that sometimes the most important music was the silence between the notes, the space where understanding lived, where community was born, and where broken hearts learned to beat in time with hope once again.